let me go ahead and introduce today's speaker. I'm Vivek Shetty, the director of the training core for the MD2K Center based at Memphis. And I want to welcome you all to today's webinar. There are a lot of gray areas when it comes to the ethical collection, analysis, and use of big data collected by mobile devices and sensors. To help us understand the ethical implications and to anticipate and navigate these tricky situations, we have invited Professor Cvrkel from UCLA. Professor Cvrkel is in addition to being a very popular teacher, is a bioethicist, philosopher, and who focuses on the ethics of data collected by emerging technologies. So let me now do a virtual handover to Professor Cvrkel.
Hello, thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about ethical issues surrounding big data and all of the implications of what that means. So we're going to do as much work as we can in the time that we have, but I want to suggest that the purpose of this talk is to really generate a larger body of work. All of us are just at the beginning of this process, both at the emerging technology level as far as usability and potentiality, but also for what that means about the ethics and the applications for both potential benefits and potential abuses. So let's begin. So first things first, let's talk about what it is we mean by big data. So the term obviously is trendy right now. And, people joke about the way to get your work viewed is to say, I'm working on X plus big data, big sexy data, lots more big data. But as an origin, the term actually dates back to something fairly specific that we no longer use as a given when we use this term. The origin, of course, is from data sets primarily in the sciences that were so large they required supercomputing to effectively analyze. And what that meant was that the difficulty of big data was really in the manipulation and analysis side. It wasn't so much in the application side. But today, that's not the kind of thing we're mostly worried about. Obviously, what we're worried about are things that are very, very usable, have an enormous amount of potential, and the analysis could be performed on something much smaller than a supercomputer. But what we're talking about then is something a little bit more intimate. So there have been some suggestions on how to think about this large category, how to think about what it is we worry about when we worry about big data. And so Boyd and Crawford have put together what they consider a unified theory, or a way to understand what this field is really about, regardless of what it is we're trying to do with it. So their theory is that big data as a subject, capital B, capital D, really has three foundational parts. So first, we're talking about technology, and in particular, maximizing computation power, a logarithmic accuracy to gather, analyze, link, and compare large data sets. So this is a field that's born out of technological innovation and development, and that makes it uniquely different than a lot of data use that came before it. So our ability to even have this discussion is prefaced by our ability to gather this data and then do something with it. And as we advance on both of those fronts, on the gathering end, especially through things like mobile health technologies, wearables, other sorts of devices that can gather data, and of course, the use and analysis of those large data sets, that's going to introduce new potentials that we didn't have even 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that leads us to number two, the analysis. So the point of big data, capital B, capital D, of course, is to use these large data sets to identify patterns in order to make economic, social, technical, and legal claims. So the interesting thing about the analysis is that the implications of our analysis are extremely far-reaching. So what that means is that the data that we're talking about isn't pigeonholed into one particular field. So what, for our purposes, that leads us to is that dealing with big data, both in the development side, the application side, the analysis side, and the ethics, requires an enormous amount of interdisciplinary work. We're all in this together, regardless of our specialty. And so to think about what that means, it's going to require a lot of crossing departments, trying to figure out what's usable in these data sets, how to maximize the efficiency of data collection, but also how to think about what limitations there are and should be. And the third point they wanted to draw was about the mythology of big data. So right now, the emerging feelings and theories about the mythology of this field is that there's a widespread belief that large data sets offer a higher form of intelligence and knowledge, and that can generate insights that were previously impossible. In their words, with the aura of truth, objectivity, and accuracy. Well, for our purposes, one of the interesting things about this mythology is that it's actually going to change how we view traditional analysis of data. So, one of the primary ways we evaluate scientific advancement, of course, is on the scale of subjects used in our experimentation. We're worried about the amount of data because it's directly correlated to the strength of our conclusions. So, the whole premise and potential of big data is really about gathering not just new conclusions, but better conclusions. And that's exciting for everyone. That's exciting for people who practice therapeutic medicine. It's exciting for researchers. It's also exciting for others' interests involving the general public, commercial interests, and so on. So we're going to talk about that. So to be specific, the source of data that we potentially can gather is amazingly diverse. So our particular area that we're going to be talking about today is, of course, mobile health and wearables. But even when we talk about wearables, the kind of data that we're communicating, the kind of data that we're collecting is far more than simple patient representation of what I was doing. So in collecting information from wearables, not only am I collecting information that the patient realizes that he or she is transmitting, so things that appear on the device. If I'm wearing a fitness tracker that displays the number of steps I'm taking, I'm aware that that's what the fitness tracker is collecting. But I'm also collecting an enormous amount of information that is less transparent. And all of that information is also usable and communicatable to both the researchers and developers, but also the clinicians and therapists who may be working with that patient. So the source of data could be as diverse as the GPS coordinates of where that person finds themselves located. It could be as diverse as the things that they're looking at, the things that they're concerned about, the way they spend their time, how often their heart rate elevates, in what way, signs about their physical condition, but also signs about their mental condition, and relationships to other people. The content of these data sets may be deeply, deeply personal. So when we talk about things like who we associate with, what we pay attention to, where we spend our days, those are questions that are really foundational to who we are as individuals. All of that is a side effect of the kind of data that we have the capacity to collect. And truthfully, this is all data that is also useful. If we want to draw conclusions about things that happen when our subjects are in certain states or at certain geographical locations or involved in certain activities, gathering all that data allows us to make far more reasonable conclusions. But those conclusions depend on facts about people that we typically think are extremely private. It also means that we're pursuing these large sets of data for extremely varied purposes. So the interest in big data isn't just medical, it's not just technological, it's not just scientific. The more data we have on people, the better we are at engaging with them, both physically related to their health, but also related to everything from their political leanings to their marketing interests to what makes them choose this product over that. So with this data, we can choose to focus our attention on the use of this in almost endless different varieties. And that's going to matter for us. The question of how we use the data is going to be equally, if not more important than the question of what data we should collect. So one of the primary ways that we do ethics, one of the things in my job that is distinctive of our method, is our job is to make distinctions about separating out things that are muddy or confusing into things that are more understandable so that we can get to some level of precision. So, in my field, one of the ways we do that is we look at the particular obligations and particular relationships between different stakeholders. So, the first step is identifying who the stakeholders are. So, when we talk about big data, here are the people who are behind that nebulous idea. So, we've got clinicians and biomedical researchers. We also have social science researchers within this category, but these are people who are looking to use the data for some furthering of knowledge or helping of patients. When we talk about the usability of big data, when we talk about the potential, people really do focus primarily on things around the medical field, and that makes sense. So when we talk about the kind of data that we're gathering with wearables and the kind of data that people are hopeful about, usually it's things like we're trying to figure out what interventions are going to be effective in lifestyle modifications, what interventions will make people healthier, happier, live longer. The scope of research that we could potentially use here is far greater, though. So, when we look at social research, when we look at other forms of knowledge within academia and without, this same data can be used to gather knowledge about different populations, how different people live in different cities at different socioeconomic levels and different cultures. And so, thinking about how all of those pieces fit together, it's the clinician and researchers that are worried about the use of data to promote knowledge or good for the public in general, or patients in particular. The second group of stakeholders we have are the engineers and designers, the people who build the systems that allow us to gather and analyze this data. These are the people that have the technical expertise and the technical knowledge to build the things that we depend upon to both gather, collect, store, and analyze data. We also have commercial entities. And these are groups of people and corporations that find this data useful because it's extraordinarily profitable. So there's an old joke, when you're not sure who the product is in an online service, it's you. So understanding the power of knowledge about consumers and the public allows corporations to tailor their products and also sell more effectively. So this makes that information extraordinarily valuable. We also have government, and questions of government surveillance are extraordinarily relevant, especially given the developments in the last couple of days, which we'll talk more about. But thinking about how we should understand government intervention in all of this data gathering and the capacity is going to be a difficult problem for us. We also have questions of public interest, both what's in the public good, but also what the public wants to know. When people talk about things like the Ashley Madison hack, the hack that exposed users of people of a website seeking extramarital affairs, the reason this was so dramatic, the reason this is so interesting is because immediately many people, out of curiosity, started Googling the results and started trying to figure out who indeed they know could be on this list. Lists were published, of course, not just of publicly known people who were involved in that database breach, but also people wanted to know about their friends and neighbors. So understanding how we use information at the private level is also a tricky question. But finally, the stakeholder who deserves the most talking about are the data subjects themselves. And those are the people whose data we're collecting and storing and using. So we're going to move forward and talk about how to understand the relationships between all of these parties, the questions that come up from them, and then also perhaps what to do about those questions. So let's start with the challenges. So the first challenge we face is a question of data access. So the basic question here, morally speaking, when it comes to the ethics of data access, is when we collect all of this data, who should be allowed to view it? Who should be allowed to access it and, of course, use it as well? So the obvious questions that come up here are questions about government interventions and surveillance. So we very recently, in the last couple of days, had by now an extremely viral letter from Apple to customers discussing a government effort to essentially prevent a technology in an iPhone from wiping data so that government users and authorities could access the data on it. Now, the information they're trying to get is from people who were accused of shootings in San Bernardino, and they want access to the technology devices to gather evidence and see if there's any reason to think that there are other plans or guilt or innocence from these parties. But the idea is this: how should we think about government interference and law enforcement and their use of technologies that were not primarily designed for those technologies and that use? So it's one thing when we talk about our phones. It's going to be entirely another when we talk about our private medical information, information about our bodies, information about our whereabouts and associates. This is some of the most private information we can think of. So there's questions about what kind of government access that we should think about allowing. But there's larger questions about data access. And one of the questions that's been most pressing when we talk about technology that's already on the market is questions about whether we should allow the subjects of the data to have access to their own information. So some data gathering devices, such as CPAP machines, machines that help people with sleep apnea sleep, collect an enormous amount of data about sleep quality and technology within there. So what that means is that I now have information, if I have access to your data from your CPAP, not just about how long you're sleeping and if you're using this system compliantly, but also I may have access to GPS information about where you're sleeping. And I may have access to information about how well your sleep is going. Now, this data is used in a lot of ways, primarily to make sure that the quality of your sleep care is being managed and your health conditions are being managed appropriately. But it's also used for people in sensitive positions and professions like truck drivers to make sure that they're compliant with their treatment so they can maintain their commercial licenses. I think no one wants a sleep deprived truck driver on the road behind a wheel. And that goes too for professions like airline pilots and other people who have to be alert. Otherwise, there's a huge public safety risk. Well, so as it stands right now, there is no way for legally patients to get access to all of the data contained on their CPAP machines. That data typically is transferred by modem wirelessly or by SD card to the people that provide and manufacture or service the machines. And then that gets transferred to the clinicians who look at the data and send it wherever it needs to go. But that data is not transparent to patients themselves. The reason that people typically give when it comes to why patients aren't allowed access is because this raw data requires analysis for patients to understand. And so the argument is that having a layer of protection in between data and patients, even though this is data about the patients, prevents misunderstandings, prevents us worrying about people taking information and running with it in inappropriate ways. So we think about this to protect the subjects. The problem is, of course, there's a way that that information belongs to the subjects. The information is indeed about those subjects. And so we're going to have to think about questions when it comes to collecting huge amounts of data, whether we're entitled to give subjects any access to that data at all. Or if so, are there ways to give them access and mitigate this problem of raw, unanalyzed data? So there's also the problem when we talk about data access of editing and correction. So right now, with digital medical records and people paying more attention to their medical information, there's a question about who has the right to edit and alter that information if they're displeased with what's collected. So there's an enormous amount of complaint from patient rights advocacy groups. The fact that some people and institutions don't allow editing of this collection, and some people have extraordinarily detailed and intensive ways to force patients to go through hoops and steps to get there. So the question is what we do with that access and who is entitled to have it. The next question we can talk about is data ownership. And that's the question of who should profit, who should control the data that we're collecting. So there are several parties involved in this question. So the data, of course, is generated by subjects, but it's collected, controlled, stored, and aggregated by the engineers. And then it's used and put into practice often by researchers or clinicians. The question of ownership is not a trivial one. So many people are familiar with the case of Henrietta Lacks and her cells that are functionally immortal. So here's a woman whose cells were collected without her consent, and they've been used in the vast majority of scientific breakthroughs in the past several decades. An enormous amount of money has been made off of the cells of Henrietta Lacks, and she and her family neither consented to nor benefited from this process. The question is this morally and legally appropriate? Understanding a huge set of data means wrestling with a ridiculous question about both moral and legal ownership. And so our task is set out for us, trying to figure out how to think about this. That connects directly to accountability. Thinking about what do we do when things go wrong? When there's a mistake in how the data is collected or perhaps how the data is analyzed. So if there's a mistake in how the data is analyzed and thus used, who's responsible for the resulting harm? Thinking about ownership will help us also think about how to think about accountability. Who actually is to blame legally and ethically for the good and the bad? Next, we have a problem that's, again, near and dear to many of our hearts, and that's the problem of security. So we often say that nothing is unhackable, which is to say nothing is so technologically perfect and clean and complex that sufficiently advanced technology can't break it. So how should we think about what a reasonable standard of security looks like that we all acknowledge won't be perfect? What does enough security mean? And where is the line where there's an acceptable amount of risk and we acknowledge that even knowing that risk is there, we're still discharging our obligations to the subjects of the data? But here's the big one. So when people talk about big data, when people talk about wearables and mobile health, often the first moral concern, the first thing that comes to mind, are concerns around privacy. Now, there's a reason for that. When we talk about the potential for harm with big data and the potential for danger, the vast majority of that harm and the areas that we need to be concerned about connect up with this question of privacy. Now, no one argues that privacy is a good. And in fact, when we talk about privacy, people very rarely realize what the level of privacy that we might be putting at risk actually looks like. So, one researcher, Dr. Rigg, discussed tracking visual attention and looking at how we can pay attention to what people spend their times actually reflecting on, or at least focusing on. Things like that, things that we can track with wearables and other devices that can tell us, for example, how to work with people recovering from addiction. Well, they also reveal a great amount of the subject that we're working with. Tracking visual attention can also unintentionally help us discover things like sexual orientation of the subject, things that we think of as foundational to our own self-identities and our self-conceptions, and more importantly, things that we care about when we choose to share them or not. So no one thinks that privacy is an unmitigated good, and the more you have of it, the better. That's a silly position. Think about what that would look like if we think privacy as a maximal good is some sort of goal. It would mean that I had some sort of right to control who saw me as I walked down the street, and I would have a right to demand everyone close their eyes as I walked out my front door. But the other thing is, for many of us, if not all of us, what makes us connect to other people, what we value in life, is not privacy. It's being seen. It's understanding that we want to make connections. We want people to know certain things about us. We don't want to be ignored or invisible. So when we think about privacy, there's a slightly different way to think about it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Paul Ohm recently discussed the failures of what it means to actually try to make data anonymous. So his fabulous quote is, "Data can be useful or it can be anonymous, but never both." So thinking about privacy concerns is going to be one of our primary challenges. But the good news is we have the tools to do that. So let's start talking about solutions. Let's start talking about what we can do in a productive way to build on these challenges and start to meet them. So we're going to go back to looking at stakeholders and thinking about the relationship that stakeholders have to one another. So the first set of stakeholders we're going to talk about are researchers and clinicians and data subjects. So again, the primary way we do ethics, the primary way that people in my field can help people in other fields is by reducing this cloud of doubt and concerns and questions to actually practical, tangible steps. Thinking about what it is that we're actually morally bound to do, and hopefully providing some suggestions on how to do that. So, the first two stakeholders that we're going to talk about in relationship to one another are the researchers and clinicians and the people who use the data, and the data subjects themselves, the people whose data is being collected. So, the first thing that will dictate this ethical relationship, that will help us understand what the obligations are between these two parties, is recognizing that more or better data does not, should not, take precedence over patient autonomy. This is hard to talk about, and it's hard for a lot of researchers and clinicians to sort of reconnect with. And here's why. So, the goal of researchers and clinicians, by and large, is to make the lives of patients, either the subjects of their data or the population at large, better, to make things healthier, to make life of higher quality. And when we talk about making things better for people, what that often means is making things better in ways that people don't always agree to. But of course, that isn't our obligation. Our obligation is to make things better for patients only when the patient consents to those particular interventions. So there's a temptation to prioritize what's in the medical well being of the general population or of individuals without worrying as much about patient autonomy. That's a danger, but it's a danger that we can solve. So when we talked about consent and privacy, and we talked about the individual privacy that is potentially at stake when we're collecting all of this data, and how personal that information can be. Part of what we talked about is that privacy isn't an unlimited good. And that, of course, is true. So, how should I think about the good of privacy? And how should I think about how that relates to things like the well being of researchers and clinicians and data subjects? In other words, how should I think of privacy when it comes to big data in general? Because here's the bottom line: when it comes to big data and the collection of huge amounts of data from given subjects, I can ask for consent, but I'm not exactly sure all of the ways I want to use that data, at least not before I collect it. Part of the nature of working with enormous data sets is that looking at the data we collect allows us to generate interesting relationships within that data. But what that means is that I can't always ask in advance about all of the possible applications of the data that I'm gathering. That goes against traditional ideas of informed consent between researchers, clinicians, and patients. Usually, what we do is we ask for informed consent, limiting what it is we're going to do, in this case with information, traditionally with tissue, to only things that the patients agree to. There have been an enormous amount of bioethical and legal cases around tissue that is donated for one purpose, for example. In this case, the Havasupai tribes to study things like diabetes. When people and researchers have used that same tissue to research on things that they did not get explicit consent for, in that case, we talk about schizophrenia research and other forms of mental illness. So, the ethical question that this case raises is really, are we allowed to do anything we want with your information, or in this case, tissue, once you've donated, even if I only ask your permission to do one thing? Now, the answer overwhelmingly that the courts have come back with, as with ethicists, is that no, you are limited in the kinds of things you can do, and you can only work on the things that people give you consent to work on. That's what it means to respect your autonomy. Well, what does that mean for people working in big data when, frankly, we don't know yet what it is we want to do because we don't understand the full relationships of how all this data can be used? One suggestion then has been to ask open-ended consent. Things like, is it okay for us to collect your data and use it in some way that we might decide later? So the benefit of this is that we're not asking for one particular use, which can then be violated later if we use other things. We're asking for a consent form that's open-ended. The problem of that is that it reduces the usability of the consent. What I'm now asking for in no way resembles a notion of informed. After all, if I can't adequately communicate the risks and benefits to a subject of participating in research and allowing their data to be collected, what is it that they're actually consenting to? Well, the good news is we have ways to understand this and ways to work with this. So, since we know that privacy isn't something that the more is better, let's talk about how we should think about privacy and should think about the protection of data subjects. So, instead of thinking of maximizing privacy, instead, we should realize that the good of privacy is only an extension of patients' ability to control who sees what about their information. That's the point of privacy. The point of privacy isn't to be invisible. It's that I want to control who knows certain things about me. Understanding that means we can start to shift the conversation away from this idea of global maximization of privacy and back into how the patient understands privacy and what that means, especially when it means to developing better and higher quality consent processes. So, in order to protect privacy, we'll talk about things that can be done to design protections and try to improve the idea of disconnecting identity from data so much as possible, even acknowledging that that's never perfect. But it also means spending significantly more time and resources thinking on what a high quality consent process looks like in an area that is foundationally different than the kind of research that's been done before. So that's an area that we can talk a great deal more about. But there's more to say about researchers and clinicians and data subjects. The next thing that's worth talking about within the context of this particular relationship and its implications in big data are questions around surveillance and trust. So these questions are about foundationally how the doctor patient or researcher subject relationship should work, how this process goes when it comes to allowing whatever the goal of this interaction is, either the gathering of research and the performing of conclusions or the helping better the life or condition of the patient, how that foundationally works. Well, part of how the story goes, part of how the story has to go, is about a trust between patient and clinician or subject and researcher. Now, the ethical source of that trust, the reason that trust has to exist, is because between these two parties, we have an enormous power imbalance. So, in general, a patient is coming to a clinician not because this is the best way to spend a Thursday afternoon and not for fun. It's because the patient needs something from the clinician. The patient needs the clinician far more than the clinician needs the patient. And in particular, the balance of private personal knowledge. Think about what a clinician or a researcher knows about a patient or a subject, and think about the asymmetry of information about what the patient knows about their clinician. All of that relationship, the imbalance of power and authority, depends on the patient or subject feeling secure that they will not have their role or information exploited. The basic backbone of that ethical relationship is trust. The problem is, trust can't be empty rhetoric. Trust is about actual steps that are taken in a concrete way to maintain this relationship between researcher and clinician, or patient or subject. So, researchers and clinicians have an obligation to protect the well being, to stand as first level guardians of the information of their subjects or their patients. So, what that obligation means is that we'll talk about gathering actual consent from the subject or patient. But that means that the second level of interest to protect the subject or patient has to be at the level of researcher or clinician. That means that part of the role of researcher or clinician is role of advocate. Now, that's not always traditionally how things have run, especially when it comes to research subjects. So in ethics, we talk frequently about the difficulties and roles of doctor researchers who are in essence at odds over what their goals are, whether to further their own research or to promote the well-being of a particular patient. If what I'm doing is putting a patient at deep potential risk, asking them to reveal things that are extraordinarily personal and come with a non-trivial risk of harm, then what I'm asking for is something that has to be met with equal levels of protection. And that means being an advocate first for the patient and only second for the research and usability that comes afterwards. And that's because there are few things more intimate than our own medical data. But there's another relationship that we can talk about. So when we talk about engineers and designers and researchers and clinicians, these are two parties that actually have very, very distinct roles when it comes to big data and when it comes to ethics. And they both have enormous ethical obligations to one another. So we talked earlier about the challenge of ownership and the challenge of who gets access, but also who is accountable for when things go wrong. Well, what we have here are two roles. One who is the technical expert on the actual data gathering, storing, and analysis. Those would be the engineers and designers of these systems. And then we have the people who want to make use of this data in particular ways. And those are the researchers and clinicians. So what that means is here we also have an asymmetry of knowledge and expertise. So the first thing that needs to happen is that engineers and designers have to have a foundational understanding that their data analysis, their practice of working with all of these data sets will have a very basic, enormous ground level change in the way that medicine is practiced. So what we're working with when we work with information historically is information about the world, information about inanimate subjects, information that's not meant to be put into practice in immediate ways. The results of this data, when we talk about big data, and especially in relation to the medical field and mobile health, this data is going to change people's lives. And this data is also going to make grand sweeping changes in what we consider standard of care. What that means is that the stakes are very high. So when we talk about what that looks like, in some ways, it's important to make an analogy between the engineers and designers today and the researchers and scientists once upon a time that were developing potential things that could be used as weapons. There's an enormous amount of potential for things that can be used to generate energy, and there's also an enormous amount of risk and harm. The obligation that that puts on engineers and designers is not trivial. And so thinking about the relationship between these groups and thinking about accountability involves being very clear about distribution of labor. So part of what that means is that engineers and designers are going to have to think about what they are going to build before they build it. So here's how we can look at that. So engineers and technical experts are the people that allow researchers and clinicians to meet their obligations to their patients. They are the vehicle by which the clinicians or the researchers can discharge their obligations. That means that the obligations that go to subjects and patients also belong to engineers and designers. And understanding that part of what this technology is a tool to help us protect patients and subjects has to be thought of at the architecture level, has to be thought about when we think about what is the purpose of the systems that we're designing. And that has to be built into the ground floor. So let's talk a little bit more about what that could look like. So here's a three-way relationship between engineers and designers, data subjects, and government. So, of course, over the last couple days, we've had questions around Apple and whether or not they are legally and ethically in the right in denying the government access to the technology that they choose. So Apple has claimed that federal researchers and federal authorities are asking for backdoor technical access. The federal government has stated that they're asking for front door access. They're asking for access to information, just like they would ask for warrants and other sorts of information on people who are suspected and accused of a crime. Well, understanding what authorities, what engineers, what designers, what architects, what people who are in charge of databases what their jobs are in relation to both government requests and patients is not easy. So there's two ways to think about this. So the first way you can think about obligations for engineers and designers in relation to government surveillance and government information is you can develop systems that can collect all the data that one can collect and then play it by ear when something happens. Or you can anticipate legal requests, applications, and restrictions and design accordingly. So part of the way we talk about this is taking intentional reductions in utility seriously. Is there utility that you should choose not to build in to analysis systems or collection systems in order to protect obligations to data subjects? Are there systems that we should think about that we should intentionally leave unfinished, undeveloped, unutilizable in order to provide an extra layer of protection? Well, that's one question, and it's a question in relation to government. But the other question in relation to taking intentional reductions in utility seriously is thinking about how that can relate to questions about security. So obviously the answer to security is not just build a perfect system. So how do we take the knowledge that our security is inherently limited and that there's no way that we can promise 100% protection of data, but still ask people in good faith to give us access to enormously personal data and private data that could come back to harm them? How should we think about reconciling those two things? Well, at the architecture and design level, when we think about the kinds of analysis systems we want to build, one way of doing that is making a concerted effort to build in protections that acknowledge that we're imperfect in our security. So that means perhaps parallel developing systems that also can gather data and utilize data in all of the ways that we want to, but in parallel have a system of opting out or of marking people who don't want parts or any of their data collected. So this is the problem that we often run into with third parties and data collection, which is that it's one thing if the person wearing a mobile device, for example, consents to having their data collected. It's entirely another if in the process of person A wearing this wearable, I now gather data on person B who hasn't consented to anything. How should we think about cases like that? I can't even have the basic moral protection of saying that this person consented to being part of some research experiment. Well, one way we can start to think about this is to put as much of our effort into the collection of data as into the marking of data, the arguing that there should be a method, an app on one's phone, a way that people can signal in data that they do not consent to being gathered their information. So part of this is in parallel to thinking about architecting and developing collection systems, to think about architecting and developing opt-out systems. We can also talk about intentionally reducing some usability, and that's in order to protect things that otherwise could be useful but are deemed too problematic, too risky for exploitation. So when we talk about tracking location, we talk about tracking associations. This is one area that people have traditionally worried about when it comes to information gathering, especially with legal and government requests. So thinking about the intentional reduction of utility at the design level, thinking about what our goal is, might help do that. So people often say when it comes to big data and when it comes to engineering, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But the time to have that conversation is at the design level, is at the architecture level, and not only once we have an enormously varied database and now we're worried about what to do with it. So there's a new role that many people suggest can help with some of these problems. So in much of the literature, people talk about data curators. And these are people whose job it is to sort through the enormous amount of data that's gathered in these databases and help make it usable or intelligible for researchers, clinicians, people who want access to the data but perhaps don't have the technical expertise or the understanding of how to maximize their usage. So data curators are an amazing thing to think about an extra level or an extra role that should start to become standard when we talk about big data. But there's a parallel role that we can introduce. So along with data curators, people who stand between the subjects and the developers and engineers who build a system, the data, and the data curators are here, and then the usability of that data, we can think about that same level having another role that we might consider data guardians. So the purpose of data guardians are, in essence, to act as reasonable person standards of protection in order to protect the subjects of all of this data. So in order to protect the well-being and discharge our obligations to the subjects, to the people who were using all of the information that they're giving us, if we had, in essence, an internal data guardian who would act as a constant filter and protector of people making requests for this information, this is another way to both legally and ethically protect the clinicians, the engineers, and the data subjects. So part of what we need is thinking about these questions in advance, in the architecture level, at the development level. But it also means introducing perhaps a new role. So if I introduce a new party whose sole responsibility is guardianship over the data that subjects volunteer when genuine consent is not possible, and by genuine I mean actual consent, where I can't go back after I've stripped identifying information and ask someone for their permission, or if there's a third party, I don't even know who they are, then what I've done is I've taken seriously this idea that privacy can't be some sort of maximized good, nor should it be. And I also can't promise 100% security. But what I can promise is discharging my obligations and taking care of what it is that people have trusted us with. So data curators and data guardians and introducing that next level of interaction and a filter between people who use the data and the data collected helps us make progress in that way. So here you can see the sources that I've cited in the talk. This is a new field, the ethics of big data, and there's an enormous amount of beginnings of conversations, but there's a lot of room to continue the talk. So if you're interested, I invite you to get in touch with me. I'm always happy to talk. So thank you very much, and if there's any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Okay, so let me begin. So thank you, Tiffany, for a very nice presentation. Since I don't see anyone asking questions, so let me start off by saying, how do you see this, the ethics issues, or what unique problems do you see emerging because of this high-frequency sensor data, which is what MD2K's focus is?
So I think there's a few unique data concerns. And one of the primary data concerns is that the people who we're collecting data from often don't understand the technology that's involved. And so what it is they're consenting to is very rarely genuinely informed by a deep understanding what the potential information and risks that they're communicating are. And I think that puts us in a very tricky situation. It's one thing to think about asking someone to consent to having a tumor removed from their body. This is a technical process, but it's something that the average person understands what the logistics look like. With mobile health, and in particular, the kinds of things that MD2K is worried about, the technology is above the heads of the average user. So what that means is that we have to communicate and protect the interests of people who don't always have the full course of information to protect themselves. That means that it puts us in a sort of a position that we as researchers, scientists, or clinicians have not always held. So traditionally, the way that we discharge our obligations to the patients is we just ask the patients what it is they prefer. Well, if you can't do that because it would involve either asking them something we don't know how to ask it, but also asking them about technology that it's somewhat difficult to understand to the average person in a usable, quick way, then what that means is that we have a situation where we're limited in that we can't use the old standby. We can't use the old simple consent form. And so the way people typically consent gather when it comes to technology, so everyone's done this, right? Look at this 10,000 page document that we scroll through before hitting the accept button on our phones. Well, okay, that's fine when it comes to something trivial. But when it comes to protecting foundational information about ourselves, things that come at high risk, but also things that are deeply, deeply personal, we're obligated to do better. So our unique problem is, how do we do that? And that's why the introduction of a data guardian, having essentially an ethical role, having someone who's responsible for watching out for a reasonable person standard of the patient, at the level of, you might say, the data curator can help solve this problem.
So I very much appreciate Dr. Cvrkel the presentation here. This is Shahin Sami in Memphis. So is this role, would this be something akin to, say, like a privacy officer when considering HIPAA?
Yes, it would be similar. But the role of the privacy officer is basically there are two incentives for the privacy officer. The incentivization for that role right now, when we talk about HIPAA systems, is both to protect the patient, but also to protect the institution and to think about making sure that the institution's legal obligations are met. If this is going to be a genuine position that's meant to discharge our obligations to the patient, there can't be two competing interests. So there can be legal authorities and people who guarantee HIPAA compliance in data systems that are required, in the United States and other places that have similar restrictions. But the primary obligation of this role is to protect and preserve the well-being and rights of the patients or subjects. So similar, but more focused.
I suppose I have a follow-up question then. In given HIPAA, given regulations about consent and about human subjects research, it seems as if there's almost always going to be a gap between the letter of the law, which are the regulations we're all required to follow in whichever role we have, whether that is under HIPAA, whether that's under human subjects research, whether it's both. There's always going to be a gap between the letter and the spirit of the law. How do we resolve that gap given the exponential growth of certain technologies, mobile health technologies? How can we resolve that?
Oh, that is such a great question. So in some ways, that question gets to the core of my work. And so here's what I want to say. So there's always a gap between the spirit and the letter, and our obligations are to the spirit and not the letter. So our legal obligations are always, of course, to protect our subjects in the way that the law demands, but those are changeable. And so as different particular requirements on what is considered the adequate standard of protection or privacy looks like in this way or that way, either with human subjects or in the medical context or whatever it is that we're doing, our ethical obligation is something stronger. And so understanding that those are separate, what we're worried about ethically is the fact that we have the potential to do an enormous amount of harm to people by using and gathering this data. That's the bottom line. And that's different than what our legal obligations are, which sometimes have not nearly caught up to the full potential of what the technology can do. So while it's always our obligation to maintain appropriate legal standards, that changes, and that's something that we should make sure that we follow, just like we follow any other legal restrictions. But the attention at design has to go deeper, and it has to go farther than what the law says, because frankly, the technology is going much faster than the law. And so part of our obligation is to start thinking just like we think in technology. So that's great. HIPAA, for example. So HIPAA exists today. HIPAA is going to be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to think about how to use once mobile health and other big data access gets up and going in far greater ways. It just hasn't kept up with the times. So the chances of HIPAA changing are reasonably high. So instead of spending all of our attention thinking about, okay, how do I satisfy HIPAA and then I'm done, I think about how do I satisfy HIPAA while HIPAA is there? But also, how do I anticipate what the real moral questions are and what the real ethical issues are today, and also, most likely, what the legal obligations will be tomorrow? And that's where the vast majority of my attention should be.
Somebody sent me a question in the chat window. Rodrigo asks, how would you identify the limit between the research needs without invading a patient's privacy?
So I believe the question, and if I'm misphrasing it, please send a correction via chat. I would love to make sure I'm answering exactly what it is you want asked. So I believe the question is something like this. So you're wondering, how do I balance research interest with the risk to patient privacy? And how do I take that seriously? Is that, I think, in keeping with what that question is? And So here's the answer. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, look, one outweighs the other. Look at public good. Look at how much good I can do if I just, violate this person's privacy. If I use that kind of argument, I would be cutting up people and distributing their organs. So here's what I have to do instead. I have to ask instead, what is the standard of privacy that every person is entitled to, independently of what their particular desires for privacy are? And so what that means is someone might have a desire to be private every time they walk out the door and have no one look at them. Well, that's a standard of privacy that's unreasonable because it puts too great a demand on every other human being who you might encounter. So the reason we say I don't have the right to have perfect privacy is it would involve all of the people around me taking pretty serious action, closing their eyes, turning around so they don't see me. When we think about moral obligations, one of the ways that we think about this is balancing my desires and the demandingness on other people to meet them. And so when it comes to public good and when it comes to public health, that's another way of thinking about what it is I'm demanding of the public, what I'm asking them to give up. So obviously it's unreasonable for me to ask people to close their eyes and look away just so that they don't witness my presence. But what about other kinds of losses? What about other kinds of goods that the public might be forced to give up because of my desires for a particular sort of privacy? The idea of a privacy guardian, the idea of having someone in this role, is essentially an arbiter to say, okay, so what you're asking of the public is too high, that is too great a demand. And so I'm going to respect your desire for privacy up to and until it becomes unreasonable to ask of others. And that's why this role is so interesting and important. I do want to say if anyone has questions in the future, or if anyone is listening to this asynchronously after it's been broadcast, you're always welcome to get in touch.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. That was quite an interesting talk and very timely given all the recent events.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.